Hey everyone, this is Pete, and welcome back to Atari A to Z, a series of short playthroughs of Atari 8-bit games, some which I grew up with and some which are new to me. Today is one of the former. Today we're looking at Zaxxon, which was a 1982 arcade game by Sega, subsequently ported to a wide variety of platforms including the Atari 8-bit. So Zaxxon is noteworthy from a historical perspective for being one of the first games to use an isometric perspective to simulate a 3D effect. But it wasn't actually the very first one. As I discovered while I was writing my Atari A mega feature over on Moe Gamer and researching the use of the isometric perspective in video games, it turns out a game by Data East called Treasure Island actually predates Zaxxon by a year. So if you want to see the very first video game that incorporates isometric graphics, go and have a look at that as well. It's one of the Data East cassette system games and can be fairly easily emulated. So the Atari 8-bit version of Zaxxon was programmed by Ron J. Fortier, who was a prolific programmer and designer known for this game, Bruce Lee, which was one of the first games we covered on Atari A to Z, and a much later PC title, Stunt Island, which I've never actually played but always wanted to, so I might have to dig that out at some point. Anyway, let's go play Zaxxon.
Okay, here we are with Zaxxon, the Atari 8-bit port, which was published by Datasoft, hence the presence of Ron J. Fortier as the programmer. As you may recall, he was the creator of Bruce Lee, which is one of my favourite games of all time, and one of the first games I covered on Atari A to Z. But this is what he made of Sega's isometric arcade classic. Now, if you've never played Zaxxon before, it works like this. You fly diagonally up the screen and get shot by shit like that. Oh dear. I'm not demonstrating this to the best of my ability, really, am I? Yeah, so you shoot things on the ground, try not to get shot, and occasionally you have to fly over walls like that. So the big revolutionary new thing in this that was enabled by the isometric perspective was the fact that you can change altitude. So you'll see the meter over on the left-hand side of the screen. It shows you what altitude you are flying at. And by pulling back and forward on the joystick, you can adjust that altitude and fly over or under various things, usually over. So for example, you've got to be high enough to clear that wall there. And if you're flying high enough, the stuff that is shooting on the ground, like those gun emplacements, they won't hit you because you'll just fly over the top of them. But obviously if you're not flying low enough, you won't hit anything on the ground either, so... Now the altitude system takes a little bit of getting used to, but you'll notice that there are various markers on the altimeter. And by using those, you can determine what height you're supposed to be at. Because those marks correspond to the sort of number of tiles that the various walls and other obstacles can be made up of. And so once you get a feel for being able to look at a wall, work out how many tiles high it is, and then use the altimeter to clear it successfully, then you have a much better time. Now, there's actually a few different versions of this game out there for the Atari 8-bit. There's this version here, which is published by Datasoft, like I say, and has a title screen. And there's oops, too low. And there's also a version that I don't know if it was an earlier prototype or something like that, but it certainly feels a little bit less finished, in that the space sequence that you saw me do between the levels. You can't change your altitude in that version. Whoops, too high. Yeah, you can't change your altitude in that version. Which makes it much easier, actually. But I'm not super familiar with the arcade version, so I'm not sure which one of those two is more accurate. I'm assuming this one. Because it just feels odd that they would take out such a core part of the game for a significant section of gameplay. Oops. Plus there's this chance to have sort of special fancy effects like the sprites getting bigger and smaller as they go higher and lower in this sequence as well. It's pretty cool all around. Although it is quite tricky to determine your altitude relative to the enemy planes. In this case, you do kind of have to rely on your size on screen relative to them, because you can't really use the altimeter to help in that point. Anyway, let's carry on. Now, Zaxxon is not a huge game, I don't believe. As far as I'm aware, there's only sort of like 2 of these fortresses you have to fly through before you meet the titular Zaxxon and have to blow it up. Oh dear. However, as you can see, actually getting that far is an achievement in itself. And then, of course, because this was an arcade game, the focus was very much on trying to get high scores and sort of survive as many of the as many loops of the game as you possibly could, or indeed survive a loop of the game at all. Because yes, as far as I'm aware, once you beat Zaxxon, you just go around and do it again, but harder. I imagine it just sort of clutters the floor up with more stuff. Like I say, I've never actually achieved that myself, so I can't tell you for sure. And somehow I doubt it's going to happen today. But one can dream. One can dream. Not on that attempt then. Let's have one more go. Yeah, I've never been good at this game. I know I say that about a lot of these really old games, but some of them I've kind of developed a taste for and an understanding since I played them as a kid. But Zaxxon's one that I've always found quite tricky, and still do even now, as you can see by the evidence before you right now. There are better games that unfold from this perspective on the Atari 8-bit. So we've already seen Blue Max on this series, for example, and there's various others as well. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm just going to nip off and I'm going to load up the other version of Zaxxon so we can just take a closer look and see if there are any noticeable differences between them. So I'll be right back. Okay, here we are with the other version of Zaxxon, which doesn't mention Datasoft at all, so I don't know if this was self-published by Sega. It's also got this Graphic 0 title screen instead of that lovely bitmapped one we had before. But you see, the game itself actually looks pretty similar. So the level layout's the same. Or is it? Actually, the level layout is simpler because it doesn't have those sort of those weird pit things that are shooting things out vertically. So yeah, can't speak. It is actually quite a noticeably different version. It's interesting. So I don't know the story about why these two versions of the game exist, but as you can see, they're pretty similar. And it's fairly likely that one of them was simply an earlier version. And I suspect this one was the earlier version because, as you see in this space sequence here, you can't actually change altitude. And all of the enemy ships come at you at the same altitude. which makes it much easier to deal with them because all you have to do then is line up with them. Also, they don't shoot at you. Oh, they do. I stand corrected. I also think this version is a little bit nicer from a technical perspective as well. So, in the first version we played, you might have noticed that there was a fair bit of flickering on the shots that we fired in the space sequence. Whereas that seems to be absent from this version. I mean, those shots still aren't moving particularly smoothly or anything, but they're not flickering, at least. Let's have another go. I say, on balance, because this version is a bit easier, I actually prefer this version, but I don't know. I mean, your mileage may vary based on how much of a challenge you want and how much of a purist you are and that sort of thing. Neither of these versions are arcade perfect, obviously, because this was the era where arcade hardware was noticeably more powerful than home computer technology. And thus an arcade perfect conversion of Zaxxon wasn't really possible. And so what you tended to have to do at the time was take something that was supposedly an arcade conversion as if it was just a new game that just happened to have the same name as the arcade game that it was based on. So this is Zaxxon, but it's not the same Zaxxon that you played in the arcade. It's a version of Zaxxon, an interpretation of Zaxxon for the Atari 8-bit. Meaning that it's not necessarily trying to be arcade perfect, but it is trying to provide you with the essence of Zaxxon. And I feel like it does that. Like, no one's going to look at this and say, that obviously isn't Zaxxon. Oh dear. No one's going to look at this and say, well, that isn't Zaxxon. Because it obviously is. Because, well, I mean, it says Zaxxon. And also, there is enough about this game that resembles the arcade version of Zaxxon to make it a convincing conversion. So yeah, as I say, back before arcade perfect conversions were possible on home computer and console hardware, it was best to just treat arcade conversions as their own completely independent thing from the arcade game. They just happened to have the same name. It was a new game in the Zaxxon universe, or however you want to look at it. You look at it as a quasi-sequel or prequel if you prefer. And I've said a few times on this series previously, one of the things I really like about this era of gaming and onwards into the 16-bit home computer era is that every platform was unique. Every platform had its own unique capabilities. And that meant that there would be multiple versions of different games. There are multiple versions of different games on different platforms that you can enjoy independently of one another for different reasons. So you could play this and still enjoy the arcade version of Zaxxon, the console versions of Zaxxon. Notably, the 2600 version of Zaxxon is very different to this, and very different to the arcade machine. Oh my god, have I actually made it through? It's Zaxxon! Kill him! I think he killed me. Wow, I've never got that far before. And yes, I am playing it on the easy version. But still, I've never got that far. Let's have one more go. One more go. The thing that's interesting about the two versions of this is that they're not two completely different versions, because that did happen in some cases. There were multiple versions of some arcade games. Like if you look at Qbert, for example, is a good one. So there was an official Qbert conversion for Atari 8-bit, but then there's also an unofficial one which is also good. Made by someone completely different. I believe the unofficial one was a public domain release, so that wasn't like a commercial rival or anything like that. But even so, if you look up Qbert for Atari 8-bit, you will find at least two versions just called Qbert. And that's not what happened here, because these are both made by... Oops. These are both made by Ron J. Fortier. So, like I say, the only real interpretation I can make of this is that this was an earlier version that was put out by Sega themselves. And then the Datasoft version came later with a few refinements. Maybe a budget re-release or something like that? I don't know. I'll have to look into it. If I remember to do so, I will try and have a look into it while I'm editing this video. And if I have remembered to do it, I will put some little text information on screen for you to enjoy. But if I don't yell at me, because I've forgotten. Alright, we're up to Zaxxon again. Kill him. I killed him! Yay! So then we go round again, I guess. So we still have that high wall to start. This doesn't seem noticeably harder. And it's the same level layout. Maybe it just does go around the same two levels, working on the assumption that eventually you'll mess up. Which is a dangerous assumption. That'll be exciting if it turns out I've become a Zaxxon master while recording this video. We all know that's not going to happen, though. Because I'll do something dumb like that and fly into a wall. Anyway, I think that's probably enough of that for now. That was Zaxxon for Atari 8-bit in two slightly different incarnations, both by Ron J. Fortier, one published by Datasoft and one apparently published by Sega. So, make of that what you will. Anyway, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.